welcome. My name is Bernard Trubowitz, and I haven't done a lot. Some of you may know me from a couple of the sites on the Freedom Trail, Old North Church, USS Constitution Museum, worked for the National Park Service, and a lot of other museums. And one of the things that often comes up, particularly when talking with students, is this question about what historians do and how we know what they do. And generally that comes down to documentation. One of my favorite programs we used to run at the Old North Church was using a single primary source document to try to get the kids to understand what life was like from different perspectives. And the question always ended with, if you had one document to leave to future historians, what would that document be? I am here to argue it should be a jail record, so go out there and cause some trouble, right? So, who here enjoys paperwork? And I mean like real paperwork. I'm talking forms in triplicate, government documents, sign in 10 places, really, really nitty-gritty, right? I didn't think I'd get a big response from that. But when it comes to bureaucracy, I'd actually like to argue in favor of it, because for a historian, it turns out there's a really positive side to it. And as the Essex County jail records are going to show, the paperwork of today is really the holy grail of research for tomorrow. So, located at what is now the corner of Auburn and Hampshire Streets in Lawrence, if you're familiar with the area, the Essex County Jail was built in 1853. It's a gorgeous looking structure, as you can see, octagonal, granite, 3 wings. It was the second oldest proper jail in the country. It housed about 237 inmates at its peak. If you are welcome to go visit it, I recommend bringing the picture though, because the modern is a little less popular. This is the Central Catholic High's football field. It was demolished in the late 1980s. The site's now the soccer field. But from 1853 until its closing, every single file, document, form, receipt, and slip relating to the functioning of the jail, its prisoners, and its effect on the community was saved. When the jail finally came down, this massive trove was dumped unceremoniously in black garbage bags. They were headed to the incinerator when a man by the name of Ray DeFiore, who was the head of the DPW in Lawrence, suggested, why don't we swing by the Lawrence History Center on the way? Right? Thankfully he did, because these documents were deeded in October of 1997. This is the original deed document, which you can see at the Immigrant City Archives in Lawrence. I'll have the address at the end. And they describe a lot of miscellaneous records and print material. Ooh. It's like when they hide the Ark of the Covenant in that really plain box in the Indiana Jones movie, because this doesn't even begin to cover them, right? They sat untouched from then until about 2008, and once they started to clean up their buildings and get a little more money, anyone who runs historic sites knows it's a process keeping those together, so they rediscovered them, and task of sorting and boxing them began proper. But again, miscellaneous really doesn't do it justice. There's over 100,000 prisoner documents, plus 200 record books and ledgers as a start. So here's what I call my Thanksgiving smorgasbord. This is a small sample of some of the documents that ended up getting covered. So there's a little bit of everything. Now, depending on their storage, the condition varies considerably. These are both the same type of document describing people who've been paroled. Very different condition, luck of the draw. The building was in a horrible condition when it was abandoned. It was literally falling down around the prisoners' ears, which is not conducive to keeping them in the prison. And as a result, you have, pigeons and mice and mold and so forth. So, administrative documents, sure. I've got registration documents. I've got bank receipts. I've got canteen stuff. We know, for example, that they bought day-old bread from Tripoli Bakery because it was cheaper. We've even got the time card rings that the individual guards were required when they made their rounds throughout the prison to clock in, so we can literally track them by the minute since about, well, the introduction of the time cards, which seems to be about the 1850s. Prison schedules. There's one. They're quite big. In addition, we've got medical records, right? These are doctor's notes. I realized very quickly I should have been a doctor looking at this handwriting. things like when they sent off prisoners to the sanatoriums in the local areas. This one book here is every person who had a haircut for the year of 1913 in the prison, right? Didn't save the hair, which I was both pleased and upset about. Parole, take your pick. We've even got blank forms. So if you want to go to prison, this is for the 1870s, we already have the blank forms filled out and ready for you. Life as a prisoner. Well, there's educational material from their classes, the prison newspapers, which are really heartbreaking. I find it interesting that one of the courses they were required to take was on fighting crime. We've got their religious documents, requests to visit inmates, personal bank accounts. They had a little bank that they had for the commissary and so forth. But I want to focus on the meat of the collections, and that's what we call a minimus. It's Latin, it's a arrest record, prisoner record. How could they serve as a resource for a historian? Well, when I was a student at UMass Lowell back in 2014, I used the 1912 Bread and Roses strike as an example. So, this 3-month strike began on January 11th in Lawrence's textile mills, which were at the time collectively the largest on earth in scope. They were owned by the American Woolen Corporation, and working hours essentially were cut from 56 to 54 hours a week. But the pay was also slashed, and this was really tough for workers that were already underpaid and had to basically choose, do I buy food, do I buy clothing, do I buy heat, or do I pay for housing? You know, you can't have all, right? And so the workers struck to secure better working conditions. This is probably one of the single greatest labor actions and really the birth of the American labor movement here in 1912. These are immigrant laborers, which they made great pains to say, no, we are American. We are trying to live this American dream. The 1912 strike almost single-handedly gave birth to the labor movement. It was violent. There were clashes with the police. The state militia was summoned. People were killed, including a small boy who was not moving fast enough for one of these guys with the bayonets, and he got it through the shoulder. Another woman was shot during a confrontation. And hundreds of strikers were imprisoned. Now, to consider even studying these 3 months, I had to sort the jail records. And again, that primary document is this. This is a blown-up version. It's a trifold document called a minimus. And it's roughly 8 3/4 inches when it's closed. So, you know, it's a decent size. And this is where the meat is, because the attached documents and specific details changed over the decades, but they all contain basic information regarding the inmate, the crime, legal proceedings. And by 1912, they also had this additional document stapled or glued inside. This is called a Receiving Officer's Memorandum, and this is the gold, because it contains everything, as we'll discuss, right? Now, the minimi run in numbered orders, starting from prisoner 1 in 1853. So up at the top, this is prisoner number 1,309, except that they actually ran in 2 parallel sets, because by 1912, they were in the 50,000s. And for some reason, there's this 14,000 series that ran in parallel, and a single run would generally be bundled, so you'd have 50,000 to 50,100. And they bundled them in string, and in fact, many of these were found still in their original stringed bundles. Now, today, these runs are generally boxed in decades. This is not how it originally was when they were kind of rediscovered. They were out in a wood carpentry shop, an unheated carpentry shop from the 1800s. And you can see sometimes when you find them, you know, you start to put them in the boxes correctly. Now, at the start of my directed study, only about a third of the documents had been sorted. That left 48 archival-sized boxes of bent, dirty, and scrambled files to sort. So I decided to speed up the process. I was told that I didn't have a beard when I first started this project. This kind of, you know, you're sitting there and you go, all right. So I rough sorted these into mixed boxes of 3 categories. You've got pre-1900, 1900 to 1919, and post-1920, right? So the 1900 to 1919 sets are the ones that I was interested in. From then, I had to pull that because I already had half a semester gone just trying to find this one decade. And so I went through the runs to see if any further sorting was necessary. And at the time, in 2014, I figured out I've got about 2,200 records. I've got the stuff for 1912. I'm missing about 288. So at the time, the results were limited. But now we've got to sort them not by jail date, but by arrest date. Because remember, inside of each form is the statement detailing the initial charge. And when they're first arrested, prisoners were brought to the police station. Then they were brought to police court. Then they might spend some time in jail. They could bail out, they could pay a fine, they could be released. Or they could appeal, they could not pay the fine, the bail could be pulled, they could be transported to jail. And the jail records only include people locked up in this Essex County jail. They do not include the people locked up at the individual police stations. Also, they still have to bring in and process people from Newburyport, from Salem, from areas of the North Shore, because they're the county jail, so there's people who aren't involved in the strike. And someone might be arrested one day, and it might be a week before they end up in the jail. So the date that they show up at the jail is quite important. I'm covering Thursday, January 11th to Thursday, March 14th, and this is where it gets really good. Because, I mean, look at this, right? So what do we have? We have their prisoner number. When were they committed? Who are they? Skin color, age, date of birth, gender, height, weight, marital status, where did they live? Where were they born? How many years were they in the United States? Who's their father? Where was their father born? Who's their mother? Where was their mother born? Are they temperate or intemperate? Now, I have to classify that this is not their alcoholic status. Temperate or intemperate at this point in history is referring to basically their deportment. Did they show up in a good mood? Most of these strikers, as you're going to see, were usually intemperate. What is their education status? Can they read? Can they write? Can they speak English? What is their occupation? So Aggie here, who we're going to cover, she's a mill operative. Have they spent time in either the Concord or the Sherborne reformatories? Have they ever been to this prison before? When were they there? Have they been to other prisons? Their spouse's name, their spouse's residence, and the name and address of a nearest relative or friend. Right? This is like Facebook data mining on a whole original, historical scale. And we're not even done yet, because we've also got their maiden name if they're married, the maiden name of the mother, any defining marks, tattoos, injuries, things like that, and did they serve in the military, Army or Navy, Civil or Spanish War, because at the time, those are the most recent wars for these slips. And then, of course, you can fill out when they were finally released. The final set of details documents their personal belongings. And, I mean, look, there's 4 types of boots listed here. You have to sign saying what you did. And you'll notice that this one is blank. This is going to be a common theme, because one of the interesting things about the 1912 strike, as shown in the records, bureaucracy is really not good at handling a crisis. So what happens when all of a sudden there's loads and loads of people clogging up the system? Maybe the officer doesn't write down every single thing that the person had, right? But for the most part, when they're not facing the greatest labor strike of the century, they're pretty good about filling out these. Now, most forms also contain the signature of the receiving officer, the officer committing the prisoner to the jail, and the justice of the sentencing, and the clerk. So you've got this paper trail of all of these officials and all of these people and who they are, right? And an example of how these jail records can now be put to use is combine this new evidence, or this uncovered evidence, with accounts of the strike, such as those in the newspapers. Now, the newspapers run stories featuring the names of specific strikers, but no other information. So let's take one instance, February 25th. If you're familiar with the strike, this is the date of the infamous train station beatings, okay? So on that day, police were determined to stop this striker practice that the Franco-Belgians had introduced from their radical roots. And their basic idea was, you're a striker, you're striking for a living wage for you and your family, you can't take care of your family and protect them, so let's send the kids to another city or another state where other strikers in support will take care of them. And there were these mass children's exoduses. And if you are a police officer or a priest or a major city official, this is really bad PR for the city of Lawrence. Oh, we have to send their children away, right? So on that day, the police were determined to stop them. Now, 46 children and their parents and their chaperones, complete with the kids with little name tags and everything else filed out to make sure they didn't get lost, were prepared at the main Boston and Main Depot. If you're familiar with Lawrence, this is where the big McDonald's is across the bridge. We're waiting at Broadway and Essex Streets. They were waiting for the 7:11 a.m. train to Boston when the police begin to gather. And when the trains arrive, the police decided to stop them from boarding. And what they did is they pulled parents and children apart, they grappled and struggled with them, violently throwing them to trucks. And as horrified bystanders and passengers on the train watched, they even clubbed pregnant and defenseless women, which, as you can see from this newspaper depiction, right, this is the Lawrence way. And here are cities saying, no, send the children to us, we will take care of them. This is, again, right, really not a good day. The thing is, there was another major riot that same day, and as you can imagine, the mood of the strikers grew a bit uglier when word of this beating occurred. So according to the Boston Globe, fines of $5 were sent out in cases to Oishula Fiak for assaulting an unknown man, Regina Yoakum for disturbance by hooting, Aggie Chopler assaulted Special Policeman Ryan, and Annie Katrautrovich. If anyone are filling your Scrabble, this is going to be gold for you, I'm going to tell you right now, for intimidating Mary Rowland. The last, Mary Rowland, said she was employed in the duck mill and the defendant had threatened to kill her if she continued working during the strike, right? So who are these women, right? The 1912 strike really was won by the women striking. This is a women's strike. They were the backbone. They are the mothers. They are the wives, the people most aware of what a pay cut does to a family. And they took complete control. They completely upended this patriarchal view imposed on society. I mean, they literally smashed the women's sphere. And there's a couple of really great examples of this. For example, those guys that were on the lines back here, a bunch of them were Harvard students who were given college exam credit if they went out and busted striker heads. So the women of Wellesley came down and did a couple of things. They set up soup kitchens for the strikers. They signed pledges that they would never date a Harvard man. But that's small potatoes, because one of the greatest examples are when the women really got mad. So these strikers are being chased by state militia, sometimes on horseback with drawn bayonets. So what a woman in a crowd would do when they couldn't move was take a hat pin, right? Think of the time period, it's a big pin, and jab the horses in the butt. And the horse would rear up, and the militiaman would fall off, and then they would go at this person, right? So they would really go after. There are accounts of these women being armed with clubs, gas pipes, bags of red pepper, really, you know. One woman, translator, even took a militiaman's gun and hit him with it after he remonstrated her. And on another day, keep in mind, this is one of the coldest winters in record. Well, the city fire department is called out to spray the strikers with freezing water. The idea was the mill district in Lawrence is very segregated by geography. The canals that power these water-powered mills also separate it from the residential areas. So they figured, let's hold the bridges, basic military tactics. So you're freezing people with threadbare clothing who can't afford to heat their homes with freezing water. They're not happy. And so several women caught a policeman on a bridge. They stripped him completely, and I mean completely, and they were in the process of throwing him in the river when it took a squadron of other policemen to come in and rescue him. One of the best quotes that was bemoaned by the state commissioner of police was that one officer can arrest 10 men, but it takes 10 officers to arrest one woman, right? So again, I ask, who are these incredible women? Well, the newspapers give us few details, but the strike records through the jail give us more. So let's take some demographic information, right? We know Aggie, whose arrest records we've been watching for a little bit. Oishula and Regina, they're from Austria. Annie's from Russia. None had an English education. They couldn't read, write, or speak English. Everyone was a mill operator except Oishula. She performed housework. Regina had been in the US for 10 years. Aggie, Annie, and the others had been in there for 4, 7, as few as 2 years, respectively. And there's a wide age range, right? Aggie's 22, Annie's 50, Oishula's 48, Regina's 38. Some of them live together. Aggie and Oishula live at 32 Allen Street, together with their husbands. Annie is a widow. She's at 23 Lowell Street. And Regina is at 126 Springfield Street. She is also a widow, and all are intemperate. Martha Jakovich is a really great example as well. She's fined $1 for loitering. Now, she's 26 years old. She's been a U.S. resident for an unknown period. She and her parents are Russian. She's one of the few I found who actually could speak English, even if she couldn't read or write in it, and she is arrested and fined for violating a city ordinance. So if you've ever heard the description, 2 is company, 3 is a crowd, they made that a law. See, the violation they probably violated was Colonel Sweetser of the militia sets out at the beginning of a strike a declaration. 2 people is okay, but if there's 3 people or more standing in proximity, it's a crowd and it's illegal and we will break it up with force, right? Now, Martha is one of many people who's fined $1 to pay, and the Boston Globe notes, no, they seem to invite arrest. The policemen say they defied them, they jeered and attacked them, and when the officers attempt to arrest them, some of the women just sat down on the curbstone and waited until the patrol wagons arrived. They appeared only too eager to make the ride to the station house. Upon arriving, everyone pled not guilty, and when they're all fined, often no more than $1, they all said, we have done nothing wrong and will not pay the fine. And when they're told through interpreters that they'll go to jail if they don't pay this $1 fine, they said, yeah, send us to jail. And the majority of them did so. Now, these women are flooding the justice system, and the sentencing forced the city to bow to the effects of the strike. That isn't just the jail for Lawrence. Remember, it's the county jail. They still have to process normal daily issues, right? That $1 fine is a major capitulation, though it might not seem like it. Because when they started it out, police court judge John J. Mahoney, he announced that anyone arrested in connection with the strike would go straight to jail. There will be no fines handed out. No bail will be set. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Within weeks, they're being sentenced with the lowest possible fine they possibly can, right? Because they're overloading the jail. These minuscule fines are being handed out basically to try to clear the backlog. Say, look, you were bad, and get out of here, right? In court, the women certainly seemed aware of their situation. On February 24th, the Boston Globe featured one such woman, Josephine Liss, on the front cover of the Globe. And the court really tried to avoid her imprisonment. Judge Rowell pleaded with her in vain, and she insisted on serving her 8-day sentence. So this theory that the women purposely overloaded the legal system, it's actually backed up by the jail records. For a full week in the middle of the strike, there's a massive clerical error in the filing of all these bureaucratic forms. So remember, each prisoner's file has an assigned number. This number is then affixed to the receiving officer's memorandum. Then it's glued inside. And in short, this one number on its own appears at least 3 times on several sets of documents that are all supposed to go together. Well, for a full week and for at least 20 prisoners, the inside and outside numbers were out of sync by about 2 digits. Right, which might not seem like much, but this only seems to have occurred during the strike, from what we can tell. And this is when, the police are basically overwhelmed by public opinion and by the weight of just the sheer number of people running through this clogged system. It's not clear exactly how this occurred. One theory, given that we've seen how they already had blank forms ready, is that they were basically anticipating a lot of people being arrested, and maybe some of these forms got lost in the shuffle, or maybe one of these intemperate women grabbed it and ripped it up or something. But it shows that the strike is affecting the justice system. We've also got individual character studies that really show, again, how great this information is. So Simon Knebel is an organizer. He helps organize that so-called children's exodus. But he disappears when you compare him to the big names in labor organization. Big Bill Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Joseph Edor, Arturo Giovannitti, right? The Boston Globe has one brief note on him, calling him the guy that was arrested at the train station beatings. They said, and I quote, he was one of the committee who came here from Philadelphia to take charge of the party of children, fined $10 for violation of ordinances, appealed and held for $100. That would be all that history knows of this man in theory. But using the jail records, we know a lot more. We know he'd been in the US for 26 years. He's 40 years old. He was born in Austria to Samuel and Marion Knebel. possibly of a long, proud race of Knebles. We also know that he was born in February of 1872. He's 5'3.5" tall. He weighs 140 pounds. We know where he lives. He lives with his wife at, if anyone knows Philadelphia, track down 1842 East Clementine Street. That was his house. He was a letter worker. He could read, write, and speak English. He was temperate compared with the women he was arrested with. Helena Glavitska, by contrast, is not a sneeze. She was arrested in a group with 5 other women. The young Russian woman, like her companions, was a mill worker. She could not read, write, or speak English. They were all arrested and fined for violating a city ordinance. They were all fined $1. They all appealed, and they all withdrew their appeal. Helena spent time in jail, having been found in judgment for about the cost of $25. She was 19 years old, 5'3" and 110 pounds soaking wet. She lived with Mary Glavitska, who was not her mother. We know this because they have the name as well as of the mother and everyone else, so it's possibly an aunt. And she did not live with her father, Alexander, who seems to be out of the picture. And her arrest documents show that she'd been in the United States for 2 weeks. So here's this tiny 19-year-old Russian woman who cannot speak the native language and has managed in less than 2 weeks to get tied up in the biggest thing to hit the labor movement at the time, really, ever, right? So these documents also shed light where little information exists, like one of the least understood events, this so-called Reign of Terror that floods the city on Monday, right after the train station beatings. Now, according to this is literally all we have if we follow the police records, and you'll notice that a good chunk of it is basically following up on other stuff. So really, once you get past here where, wounds seeked in, women sent to jail, that's not news at the time anymore, and then from here on, it's strike-related, but really nothing on this shooting. We know that from the newspapers on the 26th of February, 25 to 30 shots rang out. This is before automatic weaponry, so there's some serious gunplay going on. Police chased several suspects. One policeman barely escapes being shot at point-blank range. Even a definitive book such as Bruce Watson's Bread and Roses really makes little mention of this event. But from the newspaper accounts, we know that it was at least a big deal for the authorities, right? So State Detective Thomas Thompson collared one Santo Ricci during the chase. He's in an Essex Street doorway. He's apparently attacking with a knife while resisting arrest, and he's charged $500, but the records tell us a lot more. He is an Italian immigrant. He's 34 years old, he's a mill operative, and he'd been in the US for 3 years. He can't read, write, or speak English, again, like most of the strikers. He lives at 130.5 Common Street. Again, this is the tenement district. Most of these strikers are coming in from a very specific area of the city. Then there's the Salvatore Bruno. He was cornered by patrolman John J. Keller, and according to the Globe account, Bruno had a revolver with 3 exploded shells in his possession. The weapon cylinder was still warm, right? So you think, oh, well, it's gotta be him, right? That's it, though. Well, the arrest records tell us more. He's 5'4.5", unrecorded height, been in the US for 10 years. He works in the Everett Mill. He's one of the few people who we actually have a proper list of what he had on him. So he had about $2.25 worth in change, some keys, a watch, a pipe. He's charged with assault and attempt to murder, one officer, Richard H. Murphy, and Daniel McLeod with intent to murder. And he was charged $14,000 in 1912. That's about $333,000 today. So he stayed in jail for his whole sentence. Then there's another guy, Prazzo Dabino. He's a mill worker. He's wounded in the shoulder, and he's brought actually to a doctor, Dr. Henry F. Dearborn, by his wife, who then sends him over to Lawrence General, and he's arrested at the hospital. Right? His charges were identical to Bruno, and among the things that we know about him is he was missing a finger on one hand from an accident in the mills. So these examples show what can be done with this material, right? With a digitization of the database, you could literally search, right, through here and find exactly the person you're looking for. Now, thankfully, I'm pleased to say the documents, as you see, are now in a climate-controlled space in happy archival acid-free boxes. And a gentleman by the name of Chris Muller, who works with Columbia University, as far as I know, no relation to the probe, and UC Berkeley are digitizing the 1911 to 1913 documents. We could look at ethnicity, all right? So we could figure out where the strikers lived, and you could make, if anyone's familiar with the idea of a ghost map, such as was used in the cholera epidemics in the Broad Street pump in the 1830s in London, you could pinpoint where all of these strikers were and where their relatives were and their friends were, and are their friends the same friends, and are these people working together? Remember, this is a strike where there were something like 30 different nationalities spoken. And when they would meet out on the common, there would be individual groups of strikers, 20 or 30 of them, with someone who spoke English and Italian. And then over here is someone who speaks Italian and French. And then there's someone over there that speaks French and German. And they would be translating on the spot so that all of the strikers could understand what was going on. So you could draw up a map, figure out, is there this concerted, strike-related activity? Remember, most of these women seem to be getting arrested in groups together, so something's going on, right? How did they overcome these language differences? And what can this tell us about the important strike figures, right? So again, Joseph Etter and Arturo Giovannini have arrest records. These are kind of the big figures that are arrested. They're like the Sacco and Vanzetti of the strike in terms of the way they were treated by the media and the way they were treated in the Senate hearings and so forth. The police can be studied as well. So do certain officers show up? One woman is shot during an altercation, a woman by the name of Anna Lupizo, and during this time, an officer by the name of Oscar Benoit is injured in the arm. He is the one who's normally signing these documents. He disappears for a week, and he comes back, and he's very clearly writing with his left hand because the scrawl is bad, right? And that's just the 1912 strike. So I was going to end it here, but speaking of not just the 1912 strike, I want to give you another little, since I have the moment, example of more of what can happen. I found this when I was going to take some photos of the documents that I needed, and one of the research assistants pulls me over and she says, "You've got to see this document, because this goes right to what we're talking about. When you're talking about making connections and learning about people." So I'd like to introduce you to Michael Green. He's Irish. Unfortunately, the jail records do tend to back up certain stereotypes. The Italians are always radical. The Irish are always drunk. This may, of course, also reflect stereotypes on the part of the arresting officers, right? They're not going out and arresting the waspy judges that are out on a little bit of a bender after a court case. This is not from the 1912 strike, but I think it really illustrates the weird directions that something as simple as an arrest record can take you. So if you're having trouble reading the script, which again, this is a good argument for why we need handwriting classes and script still in school. It says, "To the Honorable William Stevens, Justice of the Police Court in Lawrence, 1861, I recommend that Michael Green, Esquire, Baltimore hero, be discharged from his prison home to serve in many battles yet to come for his country's good. James Whittier, Esquire, Overseer of the House of Corrections." What does that mean? Green is an Irish-born Lawrence Carpenter who was a private in Company I of the 6th Massachusetts Infantry. He was injured in the leg in the Pratt Street riots of Baltimore, which was the first violent confrontation of the Civil War. And now we know that after his injury in April 19th, he came home, he drank off his wound, he got arrested, and then his prison sentence was commuted so that he could go serve more honorable services to his country, right? You don't expect to come across a record like this when you're studying something as bureaucratically dry-sounding as jail records, right? So that would be my closing, right? This idea that these jail records are a treasure trove of information. And I highly recommend, if you do get the chance, to visit the Lawrence History Center at the Immigrant City Archives. They're at 6 Essex Street in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Here's their phone number. You can access the original version of this talk in the New England Journal of History. And consider this an impassioned plea in defense of bureaucracy. I know that we tend to think of it as a bit of a bad thing, but honestly, from a historian's point of view, the more data, the better. And don't be afraid to look in strange, dry places. It's very easy to imagine looking at battlefield diaries and to say, I'm gonna look at some really sexy documents like medieval records about these great battles and things like that. But for the majority of the modern era, the dirt really is in the details. Thank you. We do have time, thankfully, for questions, and I am also happy to, I know there's a lot of documents here, so I can flip back to any of the documents if you have any specific questions. I'm also happy to talk a little bit more about the collection in general, some of the other things that have been found. Because if anyone has done archival research, you know that there are always rabbit holes. And there are some weird rabbit holes in this collection. Any questions? No?
When they were I'm sorry.
Yeah.
When they were closing the jail, did they really have no plan for giving their documents to another entity?
Yeah, no, they really had no plans. So to put yourself, unfortunately, there are no surviving pictures of what the interior of the jail looked like, but I've been told that basically it looked like what your worst nightmare would be for this type of treasure trove, right? It is so if we go back all the way to the beginning, what you're looking at is a structure that was built of granite in 1853. So it's leaky, it has a bad roof at that time. The electrical circuits are bad, the plumbing is bad. Ironically, we can kind of figure this out towards the end because we, of course, have records like this. So this is a record from 1965 basically saying, here's the supplies we got, and we know which days they were fixing which toilets in which cell, right? But when you look at this structure, you can see that if you didn't take care of it, it would very quickly come to pieces. The sad thing is they didn't consider these to be of historic value. They were looked on as most people would look on a collection of records like this if you asked a person on the street. This is a pile of paperwork. It's rat infested, there's mouse droppings, there's pigeon excrement, which of course is toxic. Again, right, look at the condition many of these were in, right? This is very much not the norm. About only a third of the documents look like this, but when you consider how many documents there are, right, hundreds of thousands, they're mostly like this. And there was really, it was looked at as, who's gonna be interested in some person that was arrested in the 1850s, you know? Which is really sad, right? And
high school around the corner from there, it's St. Mary's, which was like 2 blocks away from Central Catholic, so we always were creeped out by it.
yeah, I think it's very interesting that, you know, the jail came down, Central Catholic was already there, and the only thing separated the schoolyard from the prison was a chain link fence with concertina wire. So there was kind of this very subtle, and I've been told that some of the nuns would sometimes kind of point across the yard and say, if you don't shape up, you're going straight across the yard, you know. They're very happy to have their soccer field. We are, of course, missing this building. But yeah, there really, unfortunately, wasn't a plan. And Ray de Fiore is kind of the secret hero of this because his wife and he happened to be vaguely involved with the Lawrence History Center, and they sort of knew it existed. And it was garbage day. So the day that they were transporting this stuff, you know, there wasn't anybody at the History Center, so they dumped hundreds of black garbage bags on the curb outside of a locked building. And it's, you know, thank God that the next round of garbage guys didn't come by and grab that and say, oh, well, this is more junk, and throw it away. Yeah.
You mentioned that they were in the process of being digitized. Do you have any sense of time frame?
So I have been told that it is mostly done for 1911 through 1913. Again, remember that that section is kind of the meat for the 1912 strike because the backlog grew so big. And we want to try and find out if people who were arrested really were arrested for the strike particularly. As for the rest, I am happy to accept personal checks for the History Center on their behalf. That's one of the reasons for a talk like this, right, is really to encourage people to do this because this was a free gift. This is the city basically saying, take this off of our hands. And the value doesn't come until people like you who are in this room sort through it and get your hands dirty. My mother could have killed me when I was coming home some nights because my hands were just, you know, absolutely horrific. I will say a side note that, you know, you will see I do not have gloves on. There are 2 reasons for that. This was around the time when they started saying, okay, it's okay to work with the paper without. And also, frankly, you couldn't handle some of these documents with gloves. You needed a little bit of traction on them. But coming back, all the way back to this, right? The ideal would be to be able to type in a number or type in a name and everything comes down. And I cannot tell you how many times I was sitting in the big open room of the Essex County Counting House, is basically the corporate offices and counting house is what is now the History Center. So they've got this massive accounting table from the 1800s that the mill owners used to use for their ledgers. And then you got a room, a safe full of where you can put the documents. It was great. So it's all spread out. And someone would come in and they would go, oh yeah, my brother Sean, he was arrested in '85 for drunk and disorderly. Is he in there? Well, he might be. But until they're properly really studied, the short answer is no. The shorter answer is send them a check. Because the more people who are aware of this, the more people who might say, hey, I've got 5 minutes, I'll swing by. Well, maybe not 5 minutes, maybe give it a day, right? And they are always looking for people who are interested in history, who are willing to help them with the process of sorting through. Because at this point, what has mostly been done is boxed them by decade. And the only things that have really been touched at this point are those arrest records. Remember, there's still everything else that was on that big table, right? Yeah.
I'm going to try to be concise, might not.
No, please.
Right. So basically, and that's a laywoman's question, right? I've been reading that, in a few places that in the past 10 or 20 years, most of the history-related publications or historic research is based on the research of others rather than the primary sources. I'm wondering, what's your opinion on the value of the research based on work in archives on original sources versus this sort of reinterpretation of what other researchers have?
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, I do. So the question, again, for those who might not have heard, was basically the value of reinterpreting other people's work and reanalyzing work through the lens of modern society. So, for example, taking, looking at scholarship that was done 50 years ago and saying, does this still apply and does this need a change, versus going to the actual documents. And I think that both have their place. I think the meat of our field will always be these sort of sources, because these are the physical, these are that classic first-person sources that you want to go to. However, you still need to go back and reinterpret the work that others have done. And now, ideally, that reinterpretation would be using new documents that help to shed more light, right? So, for example, here, we were only going based off of these sources in the newspapers. And so scholarship had to be done where someone came back and said, okay, wait, we need to kind of take another look at it. In the same way that, a great example would be a lot of the scholarship that's being done around the Confederacy and slavery, right? We're finally taking a really good look and saying, there were some things that were written about what was true that are not true, right? That they were seen through the lens of their time, is the gentle way of saying it, right? There is value in going back and reinterpreting history, as long as that history is then based on that physical. So I hope that answers. Yeah.
Can I follow up with a concise question this time?
Yeah.
So do you think modern historians, like people who graduate from history programs at universities, are trained to work in archives?
That's a good question, and I think that it's a, if you'll pardon a crude term, it's a crapshoot, right? It's kind of, it is and it isn't. The challenges of the academic world, and I say this as someone who has one toe in the pool and has not been completely drowned in it yet, is that in college settings, you have to fight to keep your tenured position, and you're constantly, pressured to write and to produce. And while that does give you some chance to go back to the primary sources, primarily you're often doing that same valuable work of reinterpreting, right? For a more modern audience or for a younger audience. Whereas an archivist has a very special set of skills that other historians might not have, because they have to be focused on some extra things. So an archivist has to be very concerned about the condition of the material they're working with. A person who does oral histories has different concerns, right? They're concerned about memory, and they're concerned about, you know, is there implicit bias in what the person is saying? So the great thing about history and being a historian is that that is a catch-all. And if you are a historian and you say, I don't like taking oral histories, or I don't want to teach, or I don't want to work in an archive, but I want to do something else, you're still a historian. You're absolutely still a historian. And we need people of these different fields. Some people to get dirty and dig through these documents. Some people to clean that research up and publish it. And some people who then take that and bring it to a classroom space and disseminate it. So I hope that makes sense. Right, yeah.
For someone who really wants to know more about this, you mentioned the book by Bruce Watson. Are there any other one or two books?
Yes, absolutely. So if any of you went to the Lowell and pre-Civil War talk by Robert Ferrant, he is half the reason I'm here. I'm sorry. UMass Lowell, he is fabulous research historian on the subject. Bruce Watson is good. There is another, and I confess that her name escapes me, but the name of the book is called Radicals of the Worst Sort. And it is a fabulous resource, particularly on the women who were striking during 1912. Bruce Watson is kind of the big one that kind of kicked it off. Keep in mind that scholarship into the 1912 strike is relatively new because the city actively kept the story quiet. The very next year, they had what they called the God and Country parades because they claimed that a radical, you know, feminist mill operative was running around town with a flag that said no God, no country. So right up until the 1980s, they were still, the city was actively tamping down the memory of the strike. So a lot of that scholarship is relatively new and relatively fresh. And of course, again, Lawrence History Center is always happy. Their doors are usually open. Give them a call, and they're happy to have you explore. Stop.